Welcome, everyone. Today, we're diving into the top 5 chess opening traps, simple yet powerful tricks that can catch your opponent off guard and lead to quick victories right from the start. Let's get into it. The first step occurs in the French defense. That is why we are playing as black. At this point, you are attacking your opponent's pawn on the e4 square, and in most cases, they will push it forward, choosing the so-called advance variation. Now you attack their center, they support it. You play knight to c6, adding more pressure to their center. At some point, your opponent is likely to play bishop to b5, especially if they are not expert players. They are trying to pin your knight to reduce the pressure on their center. Alternatively, they may first play knight to a7, then you also develop your knight, and then they go bishop to b5. As they do so and pin your knight, you then play bishop to d7, pretending that you are simply neutralizing the pin. The most common move by white here would be to castle kingside, but it turns out to be a sudden blunder, because so far both sides have played seemingly normal development moves. Yet now, out of a clear blue sky, you have the shocking move knight takes pawn on a5. This opens up a discovered attack, and therefore, if they take your knight, you simply recapture their bishop, hit their rook, and life is good. If white decides to take your bishop on d7, you don't have to worry about losing your knight on e5 because you can simply retreat the knight back to d7. This move not only keeps your knight safe, but also sets you up to capture the pawn on a5 shortly after. By doing this, you effectively trick your opponent into thinking they are gaining an advantage. Next trap, punishing the queen's gambit. We play the Albin counter gambit. In this position, white can still develop their knight to a natural square, but your pawn exerts significant pressure on the central squares. Because of this pressure, white is often tempted to play pawn to e3, aiming to trade pawns and relieve some of the tension in the center. However, if black decides to capture this pawn immediately, it turns out to be a serious mistake. Taking the pawn too early can backfire and give white the opportunity to seize the initiative, so it is important to be cautious and understand the nuances of this trap before deciding to capture. White would trade queens, force your king to move, and just end up in an endgame with an extra pawn. But you ruin their plan by playing bishop to b4 check, known as the Lasker trap. White needs to cover their king somehow, and instead of capturing right away, you suddenly take the pawn on e3. You capitalize on the pin and the fact that this time white cannot capture this pawn with the bishop because the bishop is pinned. Certainly white could capture with the pawn, but that's not so easy either, because now these pawns are weak and there is always the threat of queen to h4 check. White faces some real trouble here. Of course, if your opponent is unfamiliar with this trap, the obvious question they'll have is, what if I capture your bishop on b4? Maybe you just miscalculated something. But if they grab the bishop, the surprise keeps coming. Instead of taking on d1, you deliver a discovered check to their king. At this point, your opponent may realize they cannot take the pawn because the queen on d1 would be left undefended and you could capture it. If they try to defend the queen by moving their king to a2, then you have an absolutely brutal move. You capture the knight on g1 and use a dark tactic to turn the white knight into a black knight like this, and you're not just winning material here. It is actually the best move in the position because, in this case, you are also capturing a knight with a check, leaving white no time to do anything constructive. White cannot capture your queen because they must protect their king. If they simply take your knight, then bishop to g4 is a brilliant follow-up. At this point, you completely overpower your opponent and win the game. Even if your opponent keeps their cool and realizes they can capture the knight, they still need to move their king. By this time, it's too late. You go queen to h4, checking the king. Your knight controls the e2 square, preventing the king's escape, and after pawn to g3, your queen slides over to e4 with a powerful double attack. On the next move, you are going to capture the rook. Ironically, you end up capturing both the knight and the rook deep in their territory, while delivering a crushing attack. The next classical and must-know trap occurs against the Sicilian Defense. Here, you go for the Smith-Morra gambit, sacrificing a pawn for quick development. Your opponent soon realizes that knight to f6 does not seem appealing because as soon as they bring the knight out, you play pawn to a5, kicking the knight right back to where it started. Therefore, black prefers to play pawn to d6 first to control the e5 square and also to open up a diagonal for the bishop. But then you bring your bishop out, and if black plays knight to f6, which seems like a natural developing move, you respond with pawn to a5, kicking the knight away and sacrificing the pawn. If black captures the pawn, you unleash this tactic. Bishop takes pawn on f7, deflecting the king and then grabbing the queen on d8, winning the game. The next trap will allow you to trick the trickster and definitely catch your opponent off guard. Quite often, some of your opponents will bring out their queen early with the move queen to f3. This move is surprisingly popular. In fact, queen to f3 is the second most played move by white in this position, ahead of many standard developing moves, because white is aiming for a quick scholar's mate. They hope that if you overlook the threat or automatically play bishop to c5, they will deliver a fast checkmate. What white also hopes for is that if you simply respond with knight to f6 or something equally natural, they can continue with their development and the game will proceed in their favor. Here is how to turn the tables. Instead of passively defending your pawn, you boldly push it forward. This shocks your opponent because not only are you refusing to defend the pawn, you are actually inviting them to capture it, either with the queen or with the pawn. In most cases, white becomes overconfident and captures it with the queen, sticking to their checkmating idea. Even if they capture it with the pawn, that is not a problem for you either. You then respond with knight to f6, preparing to push pawn to d5 on the very next move, attacking the bishop. At the same time, knight to d4 is coming, which will create a double threat against both the white queen and the central pawn. Finally, your bishop will recapture the pawn on f5, and overall, you reach a strong and comfortable position while your opponent's early queen adventure backfires. Back to the main line, when white plays queen takes pawn on f5, your opponent thinks you're making a mistake, and now queen to f7 is coming. But then you play pawn to d5, giving up a second pawn in a row. Your opponent remains clueless, and ironically, most opponents will capture this pawn on d5 again, even if they sense the trap. But now it's too late. This move is actually a double attack on their queen and bishop. Inevitably, they will lose at least one of these two pieces. Still, in most cases, they will capture this pawn, hoping for a checkmate, but instead, you simply capture their queen and win the game. Another must-know trap for you is the so-called Blackburn shilling Gambit, which begins with the black knight moving to the d4 square, offering up the pawn on e5 as bait. In reality, knight captures pawn on e5 is still the second most commonly played move in this position. Even if your opponent is aware of the trap, they often continue with simple developing moves that are nothing special, which still allows you to reach a comfortable and equal position as black. If white does play knight captures pawn on a5, the main line of this trap, it appears to be very strong for white. They gain a pawn and keep the initiative, but black immediately strikes back with queen to g5, creating a sudden double attack against the white knight on e5 and the pawn on g2. If white continues aggressively with knight captures pawn on f7, creating a fork against both your rook on h8 and your queen on g5, you counterattack sharply with queen captures pawn on g2. Now the rook on h1 is under direct attack and must move. If the white rook moves away, black follows with queen captures pawn on a4, delivering check. Since the e2 square is controlled by your black knight on d4, the white queen cannot interpose to block the check. In this case, white is going to lose their queen. Alternatively, if white tries to block the check with bishop to e2, black has a sneaky and beautiful finishing blow, knight to f3, which delivers checkmate. Thanks for watching.